There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to, I turned off the chime, but it's going anyways. All right. So welcome to the February 6th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. We'll be talking to risk today. We'll be talking to LongForWisdom. And we are going to be getting our presentation because LongForWisdom has been bugging me for ages for the opportunity to do even more on these calls. And so I've graciously allowed him to do it. Isn't that right, LongForWisdom? Actually, no, I sprung it on him this morning. We have a new iteration of our governance dashboard that's been released recently. And it's a valuable resource. I think that it could be an even more valuable resource. And so what I would love is this group here is a great cross-section of our primary stakeholders for this tool. And so I would love to have this group watch diligently, take notes, spend the rest of their day thinking deeply about the governance dashboard for MakerDAO, and give us some suggestions about features that you'd like to see or ways that it can be improved or things you like and don't like. I'm not going to do much speech and fine today. I think that I'll save any kind of insights or any conversation starters for the Q&A aspect at the end of the call. Last 2 or 3 calls, we've been using that time fairly effectively, and so I want to leave as much content and time as possible for those just random question sessions. All right, so let's get this thing going. Yeah, there you go. LongForWisdom, blowing up my spot once more in the chat. All right, yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Long, and he's going to do potentially governance at a glance, a very special thread, possibly, but very, definitely a tour of the governance dashboard. Take it away, LongForWisdom.
You got any preference on ordering? What should I
don't
start
know.
with?
I'll leave it up to you. How's that?
Great. Okay. All right. I guess I'll start with the dashboard. So let me see if I can share this. So this one. All right. Can everybody see this thing?
Yeah, it looks good.
Cool. Okay. So I don't know how many people have seen this before, but this is the governance analytics dashboard that that Protofire have been working on, and me have been working on for the last few months. So we just released a new version a couple of days ago. So the latest version was mostly like bug fixes and stuff rather than new features. There are a couple of cool new things. I guess I'll just go through this generally since I don't know how many people have used this regularly. So this is the home page. We've got a bunch of metrics that tell you something, each tell you something about the MakerDAO governance system, I guess. So we have here like a measure of how much Maker is staked in the chief, how much is voting, how much is non-voting. You can also see the supply of Maker, which has dipped down nicely in the last couple of days. So we've also got a couple of things tracking the net number of voting addresses. We've got the Gini coefficient of the voting Maker, which is how well distributed the voting Maker is across addresses rather than all Maker. Got just a list of how many votes there've been, which kind of shows how much, like sort of what the governance workload has been, I guess, in terms of how quickly this increases. So in the most recent version, we've added help text. So all these metrics have like a bunch of paragraphs with caveats and things. It's also got links to the subgraph queries which power them. So for people that are interested, they can dig into data. So we've got some more. We've still got some problems with loading. I'm not sure what's going on with this at the moment, but we'll investigate. So
can you dig into responsiveness a bit? That's a tricky one.
Yeah,
I also wanted to ask, I think like the main issue I have with a lot of these tools is just the loading times on some of the widgets.
Yeah, so that's been a common complaint, and it's something I'm aware of as well. And this is something I keep pushing Profile to work on. Yeah, there's not much to say other than like blockchain is a little bit complicated, I guess, and it's a work in progress. So hopefully we'll see improvements sooner rather than later.
Wait, sorry, what is this responsiveness?
Yeah, so I'll just get to that. So responsiveness is a measure of how quickly Maker responds to votes going, like executive votes going live. That's what this is showing. So as I said, there's some help text which explains all this stuff, but to give a brief overview, so this value for 0 to 1 days means that on average, 25,000 Maker responds to, so votes, I guess, on an executive in the first day after it goes live, right? So this is an average, obviously, so it doesn't measure like how popular it was. So it's one that's unpopular is obviously going to do less well than one that is popular. But it gives kind of like a baseline idea of how much Maker we could rely on if there was some like emergency which required response within a certain amount of time. It also gives an idea, like if an executive is popular, you would expect to see roughly this amount of Maker vote on it in the first so you can sort of see how generally like there's more reacts in the first like week and then it sort of tails off heavily.
Does this kind of mean that polls aren't really much use after 4 days?
So this is specifically executives. This one that is loading is supposed to show polls and does sometimes.
Is this on one
executive
executive or is
I
it
just
like
tested it on mine and it shows up now after a refresh?
What was that, Rich? It shows up on yours, did you say?
After a refresh, you might have to give it a couple of
okay.
Yeah. Is that the responsiveness in response to the most recent executive, or is it kind of like an average?
It's an average of like every executive currently. So you guys also got this going up. So in the future, I'd like to get it so we can track it over time as well, so we can see how it increases and decreases. But yeah, because it's like a more complicated metric we started with just to.
Nice.
So yes, this is also for polls. The scaling is obviously wrong here. Excellent. So yeah, you can see a similar thing with polls. You expect like maybe 9,000 the first day, 5,000 second day, 6,000 the third day.
You could probably split that up by hours, though, couldn't we? Since presumably the cap is 7 days on a poll, anyways, right?
Sometimes, I mean, that's not enforced, right? Like we could have polls which are longer. We sometimes have 3-day polls, like. But yeah, I agree. It should cap to like the amount of things that's data for. As for splitting to hour, we could do that, I suppose. I'm not sure how much more useful that would be. I don't know. But
yeah, also like it's kind of like mixed data, right? Because if this is kind of like all of the polls, it's weird because there's some 3-day polls, there's some 7-day polls, so you don't really get an accurate sense of what the total responsiveness would be on like longer polls and stuff. This is still cool.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really measure like total responsiveness. It measures like responsiveness from the start of the poll.
Right.
So like, yeah, so whether the poll length is 3 days or 7 days, the amount of people that respond within 1 day should be the same for both of those, right?
Sorry, LongForWisdom.
Yes.
Are we talking about polls here or executives?
So this graph here shows polls. This graph here shows executives.
Okay, sorry, I was still looking at the executive one.
No, that's all good. Yeah, so they're sort of the two systems for running them are quite different, so it's a little bit difficult to combine them, and I'm not sure it would be useful. So separate. Cool. So if there's not any other questions about those, I'll move on to voters. So this is essentially like a leaderboard for how many times an address is voted. You can like expand this to more people.
These are the vote proxy addresses, right?
Yeah, so I believe so. I think currently it counts. I'm actually not sure. I need to double check with Protofire what it's doing. But yeah, I don't think it currently tracks everything correctly. I think it just tracks the proxy addresses. Or it like might get the cold wallet but not the hot wallet or something else or whatever. Seems to be giving a fair approximation currently though. So you can copy, you can do Etherscan, etc. So the reason I'm not sure it's proxy addresses appears to be not the proxy. because this is not a contract. So as I said, I need to double check. Cool. You can also click on these and look at voting history for a certain address. You can do this on most like address like links you can click on, and it will show you the vote history. Link to polls here, and then once this is loaded, this will show up with various things. This has not currently got a column for date, which is something I want to add soon because it's not great without that, but yeah. Cool. So we've got a couple of other sort of vaguely useful things. We've got like top executives. So this is just a list of all the executives and how much Maker they have on them currently, listed by amount of Maker. We got a list of the uncast executives, which is executives that never got cast, just for kind of people's interest in just, so hopefully people will see if one of them is gathering a lot of Maker for whatever reason. So these are vaguely interesting. So distribution by executive shows, so this dates, so these are like executives which happened on the dates, on each date along the bottom. So you can see the most recent executive has the hat, which is in black. And you can see the previous one still has 57K Maker on, and some of the older ones have 30K and 36K. And then some very old ones still have a little bit. So executive time to pass is also vaguely interesting. So this shows the average time that an executive takes to pass from when it's put on chain. So we can see that we pass most within 1 day, and then it sort of tails off. Fairly nice looking curve, which I'm expecting to kind of develop up into it from 1 day. We got like a list of most voted polls. We got the most recent polls that have ended or just happened. So we've also got lists of executive votes, which you can filter and sort. So this is the most recent one. So one thing we should mention is it's currently an issue getting the metadata for older executives, which is why these names and descriptions. So currently we can only get the title and description for stuff that's for executives that are displayed on the foundation voting dashboard. Hopefully that will change at some point soon. Now this is what we got. Yeah, you can see, you can sort by executives. You can sort by ones that are still open, which are ones that are never cast. You can find out the active one, hat one. You can search by name as well. Not that it really helps in this case because you've only got the name for one of them. But got a similar thing for polls. This one takes a while to load, which is to improve. And we have the same sort of things on here. You can sort by, you can search by name. So if you want to see savings rates, you can find all the savings rate adjustments. You can see when they happened, or when they started, when they finished, what the winning options were. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so it looks a bit weird because we changed to spread, but yeah. You can see, so when the ones are open, you can like open, you can like open polls. You can see the winning plurality, like the total Maker participation. This is percentage, and the decimals, the number format's a bit wrong, which we're going to hopefully fix. But I think that's not actually everything. So there's also the details for a particular poll or executive.
So this view, I know for governance polls, it auto-populates pretty well because all of that data is on chain. Is there any plan to have this kind of view for the executive votes as well? Because I know that this description is usually missing and that all of that has to be added manually right now.
So could you repeat that? You cut out a little bit in the middle there for me.
Sorry. Yeah, so so is there a similar page for the executive votes? Because I know that
yes,
the executive votes aren't like auto-populated with this info. Right? Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's correct. There's there's been a whole kind of saga about getting the data for the votes. Like none of this data lives on chain. It lives in like GitHubs for polls. There's a hash on the chain in the poll which links back to the GitHub. And yeah, anyway, not super important. It'll hopefully get fixed. So anyway, yeah. So for any poll, you can see some sort of details: the start date, the status, time remaining, opened, etc. Winning option.
Conceptually, is it possible that in the future people can probably even vote directly from this site if you just plugged in?
Yeah, there's nothing.
Right, there's nothing stopping.
Yeah, it's just a contract call, right? It would need like Web3 integration and things which I don't like MetaMask integration, which doesn't currently have. But yeah, and there's nothing like stopping it as a possibility.
Very cool.
Yeah. So some cool things about this is you can see how vote counts have changed over time, both in terms of count and in terms of maker. So you can see like when people are voting and like when whales are voting, and if people change their votes, you can see when like the swap happens, which is pretty cool.
Yes, one of the things I like the best about the graph is occasionally you can see capitulation, which is an interesting activity. People arriving at something they think is more likely to succeed.
Yeah, exactly. Scale for this is currently broken. That's 15,000. But yeah. So voters / addresses per option and like address count per option. Obviously not Sybil safe metrics. But they give us like, I mean, at this stage, I don't think we need to worry too much about Sybil issues, especially since there's no monetary like incentive to do that. But we do need to kind of be careful that someone doesn't start like Sybil voting on stuff just to screw up these metrics if we start relying on them. So that's something to be aware of as well. Again, you've kind of got a top voters leaderboard for this, which shows who has contributed the most to this vote, the most maker. So you can see this who's voted for 0.5% is that got 66% of the maker on this poll, and then tails off. So as I said, we have a similar thing for executive votes. So again, we got the details and the description. That only works for, as I said, the current vote or the votes that appear in the foundation dashboard. Again, we have the same sort of thing. We have maker staked over time. We have address like voters over time. We also have the breakdown of approvals by address size. So we can see, again, not Sybil safe, but we can see how many addresses with a small amount of maker voted, like larger and up to larger amounts. Again, you have the top supporters thing. You also have a versus current hat, which shows how much maker this proposal has on it compared to the next highest if it's winning, or the hat if it's not winning.
Approvals by address size is fascinating too, right? Because that'd be an indicator of the emergence of parties or maybe different stakeholders, right? Small holders thinking differently than large holders.
I think it's pretty interesting because it just shows like voting for each like address size. And again, not Sybil safe, but like it's interesting because a lot of people have been sort of saying like, okay, well only large holders vote, right? But like we can see that's not the case from this. Like there are like a lot of people have like fairly large amounts, but there are also people with small amounts voting.
So you can see the volume, but you can also see the distribution, right? As long as that is fairly flat, then you can presume there's an alignment in the ecosystem. I guess it doesn't say what they voted for, though, right? It'd have to be vote option ones.
No, it doesn't. We don't currently have that. We could look into doing that if we thought it'd be useful. Like I don't want to commit too much like resource to doing this stuff because again, you can like break it by just maker up and voting with like addresses or more addresses. So I think they're interesting, but I don't think they're things we should like rely on for data, I guess. So you can see for other things we have some details, but we don't have the description. You can see in this example, like there are a lot of smaller addresses voted and less large ones. I think that's pretty much the extent of the features at this point. If there's any questions or comments, feel free to chime in. Or if anyone wants to see anything in more detail or have me to explain anything in more detail, go ahead and ask.
I mean, I'm interested in seeing potentially how we could use this to make governance more efficient. Like what kind of historical data, voting data should we go through? Like what kind of data analysis we can do to maybe help shape future governance?
Yeah, for sure. Like, that's a good question. Like, a lot of the metrics have kind of been focused on showing, I guess, the current state of the system and like versus the historical state. But we haven't necessarily got anything that sort of tracks, I guess, efficiency. I don't know how we would kind of measure that sort of thing, or like
some sort of health metric.
Yeah, I mean, so the state maker things kind of reflects health, right? Because the more makers and the kind of this like distribution as well, like it gives some idea of health, because you can tell like where the maker is in the system, and like currently it's split over like 4 executives, so it's like 62k is the hat, which is less safe than like the more being active with like 200k,
right?
So you can kind of see that sort of thing, but yeah, in terms of like tracking what I guess increases voting participation, or like that's a little bit more difficult. Total votes to some extent like tracks efficiency. We can see like how many votes and polls like we're creating, like, or like the rate of change on this curve is kind of interesting, because you can see
you could technically also see if like somebody owns multiple voting addresses, right? Depending on like the timing of their votes. Possibly you could like speculate
maybe
maybe
quite difficult to do, I think.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Do you have any type of data that might show how long somebody sat on a specific executive vote? I say that because I go back to the subject matter from I don't know how many months ago about the, if somebody puts X amount of maker on a given executive and then painfully, unfortunately, gets hit by a bus and it stays there.
Right.
How we could track what stuff might be theoretically lost.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably do something which is like, so one of the metrics I've been working on, which is kind of related to that, is like a measure of how active maker is, which is maybe related. We had a bit of trouble doing this, like sort of making this metric, because there's a lot of kind of edge cases and weird stuff that we need to take into account. But the idea of that metric would be, we can sort of, there's a number for sort of how much maker has been active, like in the last day and in the last week and in the last month and the last 3 months. So in that way we could see like how much expect to react to something bad happening. Like if we know like this much maker is usually active within a day, then maybe we can rely on that in an emergency. But also like over longer periods, it would show like, how much maker only tends to vote like maybe once a year, or like once every 6 months, once every 3 months, which I think would be pretty interesting.
And who the real protocol politicians are going to end up being, the most active voters, the ones who are always participating. You can also see those guys.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, so that's one of the things I think the top voters thing will be quite useful for in the future, because if once we have delegation, because I'm assuming we're going to get it at some point, like, potential delegates would be able to sort of point at this and saying, look, I voted in like I'm like top of the leaderboard, I've voted more than like anybody else in the leaderboard, so you can rely on me for consistency or whatever. But yeah, I think that could be useful. So just looking at the chats, but I think that's we could, that is correct. Like, if an address holding maker has other non-voting activity, we could know they're not hit by a bus, which is true. We could potentially look at that. We could look at like the last operation from an address that holds maker maybe, and then sort of get an average or distribution for like how long ago certain maker, or like how long ago a certain address was touched.
Proof of life indicator or something, like a little skull and crossbones next to addresses.
Yeah, we could maybe do like a high, like a sort of like a high score thing of like high score, like low score of like time since last active sort of thing for large address, for like large maker holders maybe. I don't know. There's a lot of cool things we could potentially do. So if you do have ideas, let me know and we'll think about it.
Well, that was my my hope, actually, is just to get this thing in front of this group, because this group has no shortage of really cool ideas. There's lots of, I'm willing to bet, lots of silence, but there's lots of people here that are have experience with mixing and matching data and data visualization and crunching numbers. So think about this, please. This is a valuable tool. It's going to become more valuable. We're at the second iteration where it's beginning to show its potential. There's a new phase of this dashboard being proposed by the team that built it. And so if people have ideas about improvements or augmentations that they'd like to see, now's the time to let us know. And we can help you either to pass that along, or people can get involved as well. So it's a community project.
It'd be really great to get like if anyone's like a data scientist or works in like data visualization, like that'd be really interesting or potentially really useful to get someone like that involved, because at the moment I'm kind of just like winging it and saying like we should display the data this way, but like I'm not really an expert. So if someone has more like better ideas about that, that'd be good to get.
There's a whole world of things to explore about StaleMaker and old hats, and well, anyways, there's a lot of rabbit holes that can be walked down with this tool. So I'd love to get people involved.
And I think the most interesting like data visualizations and things are going to occur when in the community we're going to be like, hey, how do we figure this out? And somebody's going to be like, oh, we just need to do this.
Yeah.
Then it'll exist.
Cool. All right. Right. There's no more comments. I think I will stop sharing this.
Does anyone know what the status is on MKR tools, and if Michael McCain is going to make a V2?
I don't have, I think that someone has been reaching out to him in the last month or two, so they might have more up-to-date information, but I'm reasonably sure he's waiting for a robust API that he can bounce off of instead of having to crunch all that data from scratch for MCD. But yeah, it's still kind of up in the air. I think that there's room for the community to sort of come up with its own solutions, I think.
Awesome, thanks.
Which actually, yeah, let me take the opportunity to do a little bit of a plug here. So there's a significant overlap with what happens in the governance ecosystem, what happens in the general community development ecosystem at MakerDAO. And the models are the same, the domain is different, but we have frameworks that incentivize people in the community to build things. And we have grants programs to support them, and we have team members available to help administer and project manage. There's very sophisticated mechanisms in community development. And so if anybody in this call or anybody in this call knows somebody that's not in this call who's capable of coming up with things like the Maker tools for MCD version 2020, reach out to us and with a proposal, and we can start talking about these things. That's how this governance dashboard came along. Protofire came up with an idea, pitched it to us. We went through the evaluation process. We refined it, found a stakeholder, and then easy as pie, it just magically appeared on the internet. Right, LongForWisdom, super easy.
Easy as pie.
And so there's a mechanisms at work here. So if people have ideas, they know how to improve the ecosystem, they know how to fill a hole in our tooling, let us know, because we can make it happen or help you to make it happen. MakerDAO needs you. All right, Long, did you want to continue to monopolize this meeting with your insane lust for power and maybe talk about governance at a glance?
I guess I do governance at a glance quickly. Sure. I think the affiliate discussion has been a little bit lighter this week, so there's not a whole lot to go through. So in terms of active discussions, so I'd say, I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again. There's been a thread about whether we should reduce the BAT stability fee, which has had some nice back and forth between Cyrus and this new guy, Andy, who was discussing risk things. And like, well, it's like fairly premature. Like, I feel like it's quite an encouraging sign in terms of like having people like offering up ideas and things about risk. Because like one of the things we've been semi-worried about is like getting more risk teams or more risk personnel. So I think that's been good.
I actually have a question about lowering the BAT stability fee, but if you guys don't mind. So and it's in general just lowering stability fees in general. So is it ever possible to have a stability fee lower than the current DSR? My understanding is that no, because you'd be able to just issue DAI and put it in DSR for that spread. So the DSR is like, does it make sense to say that it's the natural bottom limit for any stability fee we offer on the protocol?
I think we've talked about this a couple of times in the past, right? About subsidizing certain collateral types for various reasons. Allowing people to issue DAI and lock it up in the DSR, if it's in small quantities, isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world if it brings other benefits, greater adoption, more diversification, or whatever. There's kind of like a whole host of benefits. So yeah, I think it's technically possible. I mean, we sort of had that situation, sort of, right, when the size stability fee was lower than the DAI DSR.
Yeah.
People were printing, people were minting Psi, migrating over and locking it up, and nothing broke, thankfully.
So is the idea that, like, let's say the BAT stability fee is set down to 5% while the DSR is still sitting at like 8.75%, that although people would be able to mint DAI against their BAT and earn that spread and basically generate themselves some pure alpha, some portion of that borrowing would actually still result in whatever leveraged behavior and like DAI being out in the wild, not in DSR. Is that kind of the mentality, and just also the benefit of having additional collateral that's not ETH, more diversified collateral in the portfolio?
I mean, if we wanted to do that with BAT, that could be an option, but I don't see why. I don't see why that would happen for this collateral type, but for some other generic one.
Yeah, like I think the main benefit is diversification, right? Like we're essentially subsidizing for diversification, because like the DAI that's created and then like locked up is like kind of purely bad. Like it's like parasitic in the way that it doesn't increase the supply, because the DAI that's generated will go back into the DSR, so it doesn't actually gain us anything, like, or doesn't gain us like supply. It just gains us like diversification, and yeah, so we're paying for that, I think, in that case.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if you lock it up in the DSR, you're exactly what you just commented. All you're embracing is just the pure risk. There's no upside, it's only downside. It costs the maker community capital in the sense that it's being subsidized, and then if that or any collateral that's upside down like that were to have some unexpected enormous drop into a liquidation, there's no benefit.
Yeah, like so risk-wise, like yeah, low benefit. Like I said, I think the only time would be like if we really wanted diversification in something that wasn't crypto correlated. Anyway, we'll carry on with governance of the cards. Cool. So the only other actual discussion I was going to plug was the dashboard, but I think I've discussed that enough already, so we'll skip ahead. So in terms of signal requests, I will say, so I created a signal request regarding the governance security module, asking whether we want to have another executive vote on it, like sooner rather than later. So if you have any thoughts on that, then feel free to go there and express them. Like my own personal opinion on that was that I kind of want more input before really deciding, because I don't really feel qualified to judge like the relative risk between like technical risk and theoretical crypto, like theoretical governance attack risk. So I think we like Wouter said that he was going to come and that the technical team were working on something and they were going to present that at some point soon. So I guess we should look forward to that. What else was there? So yeah, I mean the sort of tax during STD shutdown and STD shutdown in general is still a thing. I've kind of moved over to a position where I think we should kind of just wait and see mostly for this. But yeah, I know other people potentially are like more stressed about
Yeah, actually, I was gonna say the exact same thing, because the size supply is still going down. Like, I think I had expected it to kind of stop around, well, a little bit higher, and it kind of still keeps going. And I feel like until we kind of see where this thing stops and see what the resulting distribution of CDP holders, of unpaid stability fees, size supply, all that, I just think it's a bit premature. Just a little bit. I mean, I feel like we can definitely pick this up over the next couple of weeks or in a month or something. I'm not suggesting any like long delays, but just for now, I just feel like there's still migration occurring every week. I think we just had a big DeFi platform just migrated like 1 or 2 million Psi earlier this week, right? So I'm not really sure what else is kind of still in the works. I think what is interesting though is that the side peg is drifting a bit, right?
There was one, like, I mean, maybe more, but like I saw one like big trade on Uniswap which dropped down to like 0.9. So it's getting to the point where it's getting a bit rough to trade inside, I think.
Well, what's interesting is that also kind of provides more incentive for CDP holders to repay, right?
Exactly.
They can.
Well, I mean, unless they're waiting for emergency shutdown, in which case they get their fees forgiven, like due to peg drift.
So it's like almost like the people who are selling Psi right now are basically helping end up bearing the cost of the forgiven fees. If the peg were to drift low, like if the peg were to drop to like 90 cents, then it would, maybe somebody would cover their CDP. I mean, that's obviously not going to happen for size, but kind of interesting.
I mean, who's the buyer, right? If somebody's
who's
selling,
the seller? Why are people selling Psi? Is my question.
especially when there's DAI in the migration contract. It's like, yeah.
So this was on Uniswap, and someone would have to, like, I didn't sort of look carefully to see what happened, but like because of like the kind of the equilibrium, with incentives to get back equilibrium with Uniswap, like presumably someone bought like a bunch and then someone sold a bunch, which would have bought.
I mean, I have a question though about just the general decision tree of what we're trying to pursue with it. It goes back to the core question of what is the objective. And you know, if the ultimate decision tree right now is that if the risk profile stays the same, and if we keep lowering the debt ceiling on Psi to something that's either very, very close to the amount outstanding or even slightly below or slightly above, just let's say materially close to what is out there, the risk is hedged. We are already exposed to that risk today. The system is. That risk doesn't go away by doing an emergency shutdown. It just shuts it off and does whatever the stability fees get in effect waived. And the question, I guess, when I've gone through this cycle of thinking about this and talking with some other folks was, what material advantage do we gain as a community by waiting to do it tomorrow versus waiting a month and then waiting a year? If the risk doesn't change, but the only thing that does change over time is that there is a chance of materially recouping some of the stability fees that get paid back in the form of Maker, why would we rush to shut it down? And it would, you know, if the peg drifts around more or less, no one's really using it anyhow because it's more or less unusable. And there's
that question's come up a couple times, and I think for me, it's two things. One is just general brand, Maker brand, right? It's not good even if it's the kind of the old version, and we've been public about migration stuff. If the peg were to drift big time, it would just probably not be a good look. And then secondly, I think if there's an expectation that emergency shutdown is, say, not going to happen or not going to happen anytime soon, then it would hurt the peg further, right? It would actually it would destabilize psi even further.
Correct. And I agree with all of that. And I think this is where it turns into what is our objective, and it's a communications issue. I think when we try and find the world's perfect solution where the peg will be perfectly constant and this will dissolve itself down to zero, at some point there's emergency shutdown, no question. The point, however, is between now and then, we either A, have to accept having some psi peg volatility that is not friendly, or we have to decide to shut it down. Or we just decide in effect to say, we're going to market it that this thing is old and legacy and Windows 95 or XP has viruses, but use it if you still want to use it.
Doesn't it make sense to say, to market, especially the fact that the migration contract still exists and that there's still sufficient liquidity for majority of Psi users and Psi CDP positions to migrate. So like, although, yeah, the peg is becoming less and less reliable, we're doing our best still in total good faith as governors of the protocol to to look after the end user. So long as there's liquidity in the migration contract.
Yeah, so that's actually something I've been wondering as well. Is like we're kind of assuming that like the CDP holders are like bad actors to some extent, but it might just be that like there's never been enough liquidity for some of them to move. Like especially with like 3088, like I don't think there's ever been like a lump of liquidity in the contract big enough for him to like.
No,
migrate.
but there are tools out there that allow you to do partial transfers.
Yeah, that's true. But again, like,
and I don't think it's our job to assume the motives or even guess the motives of every individual CDP holder. Like if for perception risk and for like public optics, we have to just provide the route, right? If 3088 wants to take the risk of sitting through emergency shutdown and really testing MKR governance's resolve on like figuring out the tax and the stability fee issue, then that's on him. Like that can't be on us. What's on us is that we provide for the the greater population of CDP users and Psi users the ability to get out and to use MCD, right?
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. I guess my kind of point is that it's not like certain that 3088 that's his intention, right? Like he could be waiting for global shutdown just because that gives him the best chance of closing without like having to pay like a ridiculous amount for Psi. Because like I can't remember, like I've forgotten how much he has at this point, but if he tries to like source that much Psi on the market, then the peg is like he can't source that much Psi on the market like right now, and it's not in the migration contract right now. Not as like a total amount.
Isn't there like 1 million in the migration contract right now?
I think there's 1.8. Yeah,
1.2.
or
1.2.
Okay. Yeah, it's like there's more in there that's been for a while because of the next stage. It also means the CDP holders have to be paying attention because it's not there for very long. But yeah, just a thought. Right, so I've almost finished. So so yeah, there's the tax stuff. So the only other thing I was going to say again is that we had this handling executive bundling with technical changes, which should move on chain at some point. Rich, do you have any updates as to timeline on that moving on chain, or any problems or anything that have come up?
Nope, there's no specific blockers. I need to regroup with you to figure out what the list is that needs to go up on Monday.
Okay. Cool. I think that's everything then. Unless, yeah, I'll pass it back to whoever's.
All right. Should we move on to risk stuff?
Yeah, take it away, sir.
Okay, so Vishesh is having some technical difficulties. So we'll start off with pre-motion as and what he's got, and then we'll try to do kind of a brief, maybe just a brief run through DAI stats or something. Yeah, his battery died. Yeah, pre-motion, you want to take it away?
Yep.
Okay, so DAI supply went up about 5 million in the last week. Actually, net minting wasn't that high, only 2 million. Cyrus mentioned that there was a lot of SAI being migrated to MCD. Actually, last week alone, about 3 million. We're still seeing some amount of that in migration contract. The largest part came from Nexo 2 days ago. I think they migrated about 1.4 million. And out of those 3 million that migrated, about 1.7 or 8 currently was actually used by CDPs to migrate to MCD as well. 2 larger CDPs migrated last week with this amount, pretty much similar amount as what's missing here, up to 3 million. And they paid about 100,000 of fees alone in the last week. I'm going to show that a bit later. So the total supply is still increasing with pretty much similar rate. Although, as I said, last week only 2 million net DAI printed, which is not as much as you would expect, considering the recent ETH price rally. Usually when we saw really high increases of Ether, the DAI minting was increasing heavily as well. The thing I noticed that, so this is MCD. By the way, this is, I believe, currently the only website where you can pretty much see what were the aggregate repayments or draws or collateral being added in MCD, such as was able to get it at MakerTools. So this is from DeFi Explorer, the team behind DeFi Saver, and you can basically check how much DAI was generated in MCD and so on. I believe that's currently the only platform. Somebody was asking before, so just wanted to mention. I noticed a large withdrawal of Ether in MCD 4 days ago, and this actually pushed the amount of Ether locked in MCD below 2 million that we saw in the past. I'm guessing this is happening because collateralization ratios are really high now. That's because Ether price increased and CDP owners are just withdrawing the unnecessary capital from collateral, which was usually the case. What actually surprised me, how high the collateral ratio is in SCD. Usually it was lower than in MCD. Now it's almost at 430%, and I'm guessing this may be due to general inactivity we're seeing, right? In SCD, there's about half of debt, as I showed like 2 weeks ago, I think. Those CDPs weren't really interacting during the migration, and on average, the last time they interacted was more than 6 months ago. So it's not only this thing that these CDPs are not migrating; they're not even, withdrawing some of the collateral which you usually see. Debt ceiling is now at 30 million of SCD, so this should leave us with about 7 million buffer. Actually, 8 million if this SAI is burnt that's in migration contracts. So 8 million is pretty. I mean, it's
Can I
quite
stop you
a
for
lot.
a sec?
Sure.
Sorry, I think that's a really interesting point actually about the collateralization ratio, because wouldn't that be one of the few indicators we have for if the CDP owners are active or kind of in touch with what's going on, right? Because that behavior shouldn't really differ much from MCD to SCD. So if we're trying to gauge active CDP holders, right? Because you can't go by the DAI supply because they may not be adding or wiping debt, obviously, because that's risky because of kind of the PEG and the potential tax and stuff. But the collateralization ratio should theoretically stay in line.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This was my point actually. But if you think about it, we've seen even higher collateralization ratio. So the ratio itself is, it's related to leverage. So one theory is that, they're not active, obviously, but the other could be that, they're just okay with leaving Ether in collateral and not really removing it and converting it into something stable. So this might also tell you that they're really bullish, right? But I'm leaning towards the first, right? It's more related to general inactivity we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, because if they just wanted to leave it in deliberately, then so would the CDP holders, right? Why would there be a difference?
True.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, yeah, I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, there's 8 million buffer now, or available Psi minting. Actually 7, as I said, but 8 if the remaining Psi get burnt, if CDPs migrate. This should be, of course, enough if there's a sudden Psi liquidity shortage and new Psi needs to be minted. On the other hand, we had debates that we shouldn't, or we wouldn't want to have too high buffer because we don't want to see unnecessary Psi printing. So I basically checked, was there any Psi printing in the last 2 weeks? Basically, I mean, I have my own tables, but I'm just showing you this top 100 CDPs data from MakerScan. You can check for the ones who were drawing Psi, how much they minted it, and the numbers are actually really low. I haven't actually noticed any new SCD CDPs trying to mint significant amount of Psi. At most, you could see some CDPs still using SCD and, I don't know, minting 10,000 Psi or a few thousand Psi, but I don't see any Psi minting activity, to be honest, any higher one. The next thing is DAI in DSR. It's at all-time high. 50% of all DAI is locked in DSR, probably because the Psi savings rate is, of course, at all-time high as well. But also what I notice is that on Compound, the DAI lending market actually surpassed the USDC lending markets. So just in the last month, the DAI supply at Compound went from 20 to 30 million. And I'm also guessing this ratio will increase in favor of DAI versus USDC. The last time we saw DAI lenders dominating USDC at Compound was, I think, more than 5 months ago, even before the migration. Why I believe the DAI will dominate is because, of course, the supply rate is now much higher for DAI because the unutilized part goes to DSR. At Compound, this, of course, isn't the case, right? Psi still has some amount of liquidity there. We're not sure why this is not reducing at all. In the last few weeks, it just became a bit sticky, and I don't know, perhaps just users are unaware, or some Psi speculators, I don't know, just deposited there to earn some extra fees. Next thing, okay, yeah, here is the CDAI supply. You can see how it rose at Compound. So this is DAI lending at Compound. The last month or two, it reached almost 30 million. I want to focus a bit on the remaining Psi holders. So here we have, what's the last day here? So we have grouped addresses by amount of Psi they hold. And you can see that basically 3 categories. So the ones holding from 10,000 Psi to 100,000 Psi, and then the ones from 100,000 to million and million plus, they hold, I think 22 million or even more of the supply, which is pretty much, you know, all of the supply that's out there. I think 90%. And if you want to see how many addresses are represented by these wallets, it's almost 300, so 280 something. What was also interesting was that, you know, knowing that only 100 Psi holders, they represent 80% of the supply. I thought the number will be much bigger, but it's fun if you compare it with top CDP holders at SCD. Pretty much the same percentage. So you could say basically that we are waiting for 100 Psi addresses to match with 100 top Psi CDPs. And if, of course, they would migrate all at once, you would be left with only about 10 to 15% of available supply currently, which is few million. So you could say that we are basically waiting for 200 entities to, you know, finish this migration action. I mean, finish, to really be left with only few million Psi. It's not entirely correct though, because Psi addresses are represented by more people, right? Compound again represents 100 people there, but I'm still estimating like there's 200 to 300 people who we are waiting for to really have only a few million Psi left, right, to perform this migration. Just the last thing, I've checked which CDPs migrated. So this is the table I showed 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago when I wanted to estimate what type of, how the debt is structured at SCD. The inactivity, who is wiping the debt, who is minting more debt. And they just wanted to see what changed during this last 2 weeks, or I think it's even more like 17 days. And I've noticed that, yeah, migration is still going on. CDPs are migrating. In those days, 8 CDPs, larger ones, migrated and they paid 4 million Psi, and they paid more than 300,000 fees. So last week alone, 100,000 fees. So the red ones are marked, which migrated in this period. So they should be actually excluded from this table. But what's interesting though is that these CDPs which migrated are still the ones who were active during the whole period, right? We're still not seeing any activity of inactive CDPs at all, even in the last 2 weeks. And another thing I wanted to show that migration is still alive. I'm using this nice dashboard from Dune Analytics. You can basically check how many CDPs migrate daily. So the average is still around 10. I'm not sure if this page actually shows the ones who are migrating partially. I'm guessing that not. This is only the one. This shows only the ones that are using migration tool. But still, it's a good thing to see. And here I noticed the large increase of Psi inventory in migration contracts. So this is the spike 2 days ago when Exxon migrated. And that's, I think, pretty much from my side today.
Awesome, thanks. That was a ton of data. Nice though. So yeah, I think that's it for risk. We can open it up for Q&A and discuss anything. If anybody has any topics they want to talk about.
So when I know that there was a thread talking about whether we should revisit the governance security module delay vote. So I was curious about maybe like Derek's perspective on the whole trade-off, whether it's appropriate to start bringing that up again, or whether we want some sort of like process defined and spec'd out for solving bugs that can maybe figure out a way to get around a delay if one existed or something like that. But I'm curious to revisit that conversation.
Yeah. David, I think the latest on that was that Wada was having a conversation with the smart contracts team yesterday evening, and he was going to come back to us next week. If he doesn't, I'm more than happy to, but I know that they were having some discussions in that space from a technical perspective.
Oh, that's awesome. That's good to know.
Yeah, if I understood it correctly, they're working on kind of a middle of the road hybrid that can get us a little bit of the best of both worlds for the short term. Yeah, I think we still have to be a little bit more patient for waiting on the technical team for an update on it.
Yeah, he also said that they have a positive result, so seems promising.
Sweet.
One other thing that was missed in the forum, I started to reduce the frequency of the DSR spread governance poll. So go vote and talk on that if you want.
Well, I'd like to hear like a recap a bit, Sam, of your thinking here. And the reason I'm asking is, do we have enough data points to know whether it's time to start thinking about this, or is what timelines you're thinking about?
Yeah, so I mean, this was kind of pointed out 2 weeks ago. I was just kind of waiting to like double check and make sure that the votes would kind of coalesce around 0-ish, and it seems that's the case. This week, actually, it's gone up. The 0.5 has actually garnered the most votes, but regardless of like the specifics of if it's 0.5 or 0.25, I feel that it's weekly is just excessive, and so
yeah, I think that well, I'm the poor sap that has to type these things in every week, so I agree with you just on that standpoint. But the thing that I'm curious about though is, do we feel that the ecosystem understands what a spread is as opposed to the way that we were doing things before? Have they internalized the idea of what this thing actually implies, that it's a back and forth between MKR maximalists and DSR maximalists almost, or interest seekers, and whether we've seen the ecosystem sort of settle out on this. So we've done it for 2 weeks, and we have feedback based on current market conditions. I'm throwing that out there. I just want to get a sense of whether.
I have a few thoughts on that. I mean, and if the community is not kind of cognizant of this, then we should keep repeating it. But the point of the spread, and there's no point in, before we had a DSR and a stability fee, we haven't really made any efficiencies. If we just now have a stability fee and a spread, it's still 2 poles. The idea is that the spread, which is kind of more reflective of the underlying collateral, should be a slow moving number. It shouldn't be changing week to week, presumably because the quality of the collateral shouldn't be changing week to week. So in that sense, you could reduce that frequency. So the community should vote on what they want the spread to be, and then, I mean, barring any significant events, they shouldn't really need to think about that again for, say, a month or a quarter or something. And then all they would have to vote on is the other component. So in theory, it should be able to reduce the number of polls that would have to occur every week.
Yeah, and also to add on to that, maybe a way to see if people understand or are engaging with the spread question versus like the manual rate setting. A good thing to do might be to compare the polls for the spread as of recent as compared to like the polls for DSR adjustments, and just to compare how many unique addresses, if there's similar addresses. Like that would be an interesting little piece of research for somebody to do.
I think the initial DSR spread actually, I think it had 72K maker voting. I can't recall a governance poll that actually had higher maker voting. So it's a pretty high number.
It's one of the top ones, yeah. Like it's on the
nice
dashboard.
Yes, so this discussion is a valuable one, and it's one that I've raised the specter of this topic. I think maybe it was last year, towards the end of the year, and I want to do it again. That was on my topic of conversation starters for this call, is cadence. These boring conversations that we've been having for the longest time, but I think they're fairly significant. And operational overhead, cognitive overhead that we impose on the ecosystem every week is an issue that I think directly relates to apathy and engagements. Our desire, and this is the potentially inflammatory discussion I want to have, is I'm not entirely convinced that we have conclusive evidence that the decisions we make on a week-to-week basis in regards to the rates have the impact on the ecosystem or on the peg specifically that we assume that they do. I think there's compounding factors. There's a significant amount of lever pulling that goes on, and maybe I'm just naturally skeptical to a fault, but I'm not convinced that we pull a lever and we see numbers go up and numbers go down. We assume, oh, okay, well, that's because we pulled this lever. I'm not sure that's the case all the time. One of the examples, well, maybe this week would be a decent example. We've seen a fairly unusual reaction or activity in the market in that ETH has gone up, surprisingly. That's a cool activity. event has significant impacts on the way that the market behaves. But we didn't pass an executive until just recently. So presumably our peg didn't move in response to all this newfound euphoria. And so the question I have in my mind is, the pegs seem fine regardless. So do we, it's all anecdotal at this point. I'm looking at a graph, I look at a number, I think, huh, and then I move on with my life. So obviously that's not what scientific governance is all about. What scientific governance should be about, though, is us knowing that the things that we do on a week-to-week basis have some effect on the market or on the peg. I'm not convinced that we're at that point yet. So that's one of the things that I want to just put sort of a bug in people's ears, that let's not lose sight of some sort of an initiative to figure out whether what we're doing actually makes sense and has the effects that we think it does. And then does that tie back into the cadence question, which links back to what you're talking about, Sam? Like, obviously, asking everybody to like pick 0.25 or 0.5 or 0 every week might not be an effective use of time, and we're not giving it enough not enough lead time for us to even figure out whether it did anything. And that's a larger issue that I want our ecosystem to start thinking about. So maybe, Cyrus, I'm going to throw you under the bus here. Yeah, I could see you like starting to sweat slowly down there in the corner of the window. So it's, how do we figure this out, man? Where's the magic graph that shows us whether what we did makes any difference?
I don't think you can definitively prove causation.
I know, but
so I mean, if you have
narrow it down.
I mean, can we narrow it down? Yeah,
does reducing the cadence help?
With a sufficient data set, though, we can say that, like, okay, like over the course of the last year and a half, we've moved the stability fee up by a noticeable margin, and all other things being equal, on a relatively steady value of ether, this is what happened to the DAI peg. You can start making some guesses at that point, right? I just don't feel like we have that data set.
Right, but I mean, intuitively, regardless of if it truly had an effect or not, the data is going to show that it did work, right? Because the peg is still exactly where it is. You're not going to find.
I mean,
what you're really interested in,
the peg is still stable too, right? That's I think the data will also show that a sizable amount of time where we didn't do anything, the market sort of homeostasis kicked in, right? That the peg managed itself week to week. Like, we don't know whether that would be the case over 6 weeks of like no voting, but it would just be, obviously, you're right. Like, nobody can predict the market. This is an irrational space we all exist in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But still, I think that it's worth devoting some thoughts to how do we figure out whether what we do on a week-to-week basis is actually having an effect on the market.
Yeah, we'll put some resources into that, since you since you bug us about it every. But I mean, I can tell you right now, like, you're not going to be able to prove a definitive cause and effect relationship. So I mean, I think we can all agree on that.
So you can't prove anything in this space, but like a good faith effort to just say, like, oh, look at this. Whenever we do this to the DSR, this thing seems to happen. Whenever we do this to the stability fee, that thing seems to happen 50% of the time. So maybe that's a good idea. Or we could find out that like 90% of the time, there's not even a blip. And then that might be a cause for some reflection on how often we vote on things.
Yeah, and to Rich's point, and I think Vishesh definitely brought it up in the past as well, it's that if the cadence is too high, it doesn't give enough of a time period, right? So do we lose anything from reducing the cadence even experimentally? So even bi-weekly, something like that?
Yeah, and I think that we have anecdotal evidence. So it's obviously we need to have some kind of concerted, reasonably thought out effort in order to test this idea if the community is interested in it. But I've seen us, like, a week executives go through, or well, a couple times, and very little noticeable impact on the peg. And so maybe I just looked at the wrong graph. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Maybe I was drunk that week. So we don't know whether there's something happening here. But I think that it behooves us to actually start. We have data now that we should be looking at to try and figure out whether what it is that we're doing has the effect that we assume that it does.
I think like testing different cadences is potentially a good idea. Like we could like have this vote, right, and like this signal thread, and then the end thing we could agree to could be we will try like the consensus option for like 6 months and then revisit this and determine whether we want to like stick with that or try something else. Like it doesn't have to. We could define that directly in the poll, is to say like this is a trial for X date, at which point we will confirm or like reset and try something else.
Yeah. Well, I'm just concerned that I have tons and tons and tons of years, decades almost, of experience watching graphs and then changing something and waiting for that graph to change. Admittedly, it had nothing to do with money, but still, I know the cognitive pitfalls that can descend on people, where you look at a graph and you try to find a narrative. You do one thing and then you look over there and see something happen. You assume that, okay, these two things are obviously related. Or you don't do something over here and something over there happens, and you assume that whatever that was because you didn't do anything. So that we have some human failings that we need to compensate for. And particularly in the crypto space, people are desperate to see like, oh, that graph just changed. So obviously we know why, because somebody posted something in China on a blog. We grasp for correlations, and so it would be interesting to start reducing our reliance on those correlations as much as we possibly can.
Just 2 cents here.
There he is. I summoned him.
Are you able to hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, David, so this is not a new conversation. We have a little bit additional complexity this time because of the DSR. And so sifting out what's actually going on is, as Cyrus just said, not easy. And it's not going to be clean, and it's going to be hard for us to reuse data from the SCD world for the MCD world because there are some fundamental differences. The other point, which I think is well brought up, is the stability of the peg. I am not attributing to changes that have been made in the stability fee. The stability of the peg, I'm attributing partially, yes, maybe due to effects from the DSR, but definitely due to differences in the ETH price ecosystem, due to increased aggregate amount of DAI supply and DAI demand compared to what had been seen in the past. I mean, it's, unless there's a tremendous amount of oversupply and we're just not seeing any indicator of that, it's significantly grown in just the aggregate amount of demand and the matching amount of supply. Plus a lot more maturity in the liquidity of DAI and people's sort of desire and willingness to market make DAI and things like that. So there are a lot of factors at play, and I think many of them contribute to the stability of the peg. I don't think that what's driving that is, the stability fee per se. And that's something that's harder to measure. I think people tend to cling to the stability fee as an easy answer because it's something that's under your control and it's something that's easy to measure. And so the human psychological bias is to jump at that as an answer and explaining as a driver of whatever it is you're measuring. But I don't think it's quite as simple as that. And I do think it's a lot of external forces that aren't being measured, explicitly in this whole conversation that are probably driving a lot more of that peg stability lately.
Yeah, I think that we can't underestimate. I agree with you, Vishesh. We can't underestimate the impact of just this dawning awareness in the ecosystem that this peg is being actively managed, and so tomfoolery will no longer be tolerated, and so that encourages external actors to take it seriously, to hedge, to look for arbitrage opportunities to get. Anyways, the confidence that's created by actually having things happen, potentially, and I'm not saying this is the case, but it could potentially have more active value on stabilizing the peg than actually moving things up a couple bips every single week. But I don't know. So that's just another assumption. What I would dearly love, though, is to make some effort to try and figure that out.
I mean, as a counterpoint, and I mean, I agree just generally that it's a super complex question, but I think empirically, maybe anecdotally, we have just plenty of evidence that shows it does have an effect, right? When the stability fee goes up, the wider community is up in arms, right, about how high the fees are. And over the past few weeks, we've seen like absolutely just tremendous interest in the DSR
Well, sure.
from
But
kind of the
those
far.
Those are different things, though, right? Like, I'm talking about us. I'm not saying that what we do here is a complete waste of time. We should all pack it in, right? Like that's not.
That's literally what you've been saying, though.
That's literally not what I've been saying. Absolutely not what I've been saying. That's what you've been hearing, Cyrus. So I want you to pay attention. What I'm saying is that this week-to-week tweaking of numbers, we on Monday we come with the poll, we execute that on a Friday, we move a number, and then 7 short days later we do it again, we do it again, we do it again, and then we have no idea how long it takes those things to come into effect, what impacts they might have on the market, whether there's confounding factors that are negating or amplifying the things that we're doing. We're assuming that because we're furiously active and the peg is stable, that those two things are directly connected. What I'm curious about is, do we need to do it every week? Do we need to can we do it every 2 weeks? Maybe 3 weeks?
Okay, like, so the question is more broadly it works, but do we actually have any increased signal by tweaking it every week versus every month? Like, is the increase in is efficiency increase worth the overhead? Yes, precisely. That's a good question, for sure.
Yeah, one issue I've been seeing this week's governance poll is that the parameters were set to move from the week before's executive vote, because the one that went in last Friday didn't pass. And me, I'm fairly active on the system. I accidentally, I kind of missed that and voted for the 8 on the DAI stability fee, thinking it's no change. I'm voting for no change. And then I realized they came back on like Tuesday or Wednesday, and I'm like, oh, oops, I meant to keep no change at 9. So I'm wondering if some of the votes were mistakenly put there.
Yeah, I'm the poor slob that has to submit these things on Sunday at like 11 p.m. just in order to give the executive a maximal amount of time to pass before we need to get the next batch of polls in. And for the last couple of weeks, it's been a bit slightly nerve-wracking, because there's been almost a 50-50 split on the executives when I'm attempting to anticipate what an accurate poll range would be for the following week. And so, do I need to guess what the picture is previously? Do I need to guess whether this executive is going to pass? So there's that confusion, because within the intervening 6 hours, maybe the executive passes, and now these polls are slightly skewed because they don't represent the correct range they should. And then there's the other thing too, that these polls are going in that reflect a picture of the system, of our ecosystem, that's only existed for 3 hours. So how can anybody make any reasonable guesses about the impacts of the previous numbers if they've only been operating for 3 hours, and we're about to change them again based on what we think the impact on the peg has been? It just feels like we're chasing outputs, and we don't know whether the inputs had a direct effect. That makes me
okay. Well, we can. I mean, sorry. We can acknowledge that it definitely has some positive impact, because if it was like completely useless doing it every week instead of, say, every month, then the polls, the executive votes would just be no change for across the board for 3 out of 4
Well, you're assuming
weeks.
rational acting, right? Like, assuming that everybody understood that there was no point in voting every week, they would just presumably do all the research and go, okay, well, then it's been 3.5 weeks. I haven't seen personally a direct correlation, so I am going to ensure that the system doesn't change at all. We don't see that. We see these executives, these polls are reflecting whatever the current state of the system might be. And we've seen that over and over again in Reddit and the chat and all the rest, that people boost in and go like, oh my God, the peg is off by 1%. Why aren't people raising the fee? We have to raise the fee, like based on what happened yesterday, right?
Yeah, I agree with Rich. I think usually that's the type of reaction that you see out of this community, is like when the peg is off slightly below, then there's a call to raise the stability fee. When the peg is slightly above, there's you know, a call to lower the stability fee. And that kind of reaction seems fairly predictable at this point. I'm not saying that the impact, the actual quantitative impact of making those changes is predictable, but the call for the reaction is predictable. And so there was a loaded statement, I think, in something you said, where you were saying, we know it has a positive impact. Well, we know it has an impact. I don't think anybody has a clear picture that that impact in any given moment is positive or negative. And that would sort of necessitate having an idea of like, okay, well, the peg is currently lower by this amount for this period of time because of this reason. And because the stability fee will have this impact on that underlying reason, we know it will solve this problem, right? And like that kind of end-to-end process is not as clear and predictable as I think people would like it to be. So there's a point to consider, which is what is the impact of your actions and what's the most direct way to solve the problem that you think you're solving. And the point is like, if the problem is that the peg is low because there's too much DAI floating out there, then what's the most direct way to solve that problem? Well, your expectation is by raising the stability fee, you're going to get people to pay back some of their debt and, you know, as a consequence, try to purchase up some DAI. But that is a really dependent question on, what are they going to do that for? Like, why would they do that, right? Well, they would do that if there's enough of a delta between those rates, because they want to be engaging in this leveraging behavior anyway. So now what you're saying is that increased stability fee would have enough of an impact to get them to migrate to, say, Compound, for example. And because you're not likely to, with a 1 or 2% change in the stability fee, get people to change their overall behavior of what they're trying to do on ETH. It would primarily be you're trying to get them to change how they're engaging in those behaviors and theoretically soak up some DAI on the open market to theoretically fix the price. Now with the DSR though, there's an additional lever, which is something to consider. Like, is that a more direct way of soaking up DAI that's sitting out there on the open market? And the answer is potentially yes. I mean, if you have a 9% yield floating out there, that's a pretty significant yield, I would say, compared to the traditional world, compared to other options in crypto. And it's seeing really heavy utilization. There's something to consider there where, do you want the DSR to be the kind of function where it's just a flat 9% sitting out there that people can take advantage of and will get into DAI simply for the purpose of chasing that yield? Or do you want to use that as something that you can move up when you need to as a lever for offering more yield to more directly pull DAI off the open market? Whereas the stability fee is obviously an indirect lever. And so like, these are questions to consider. I don't really hear anybody having this kind of discussion though. That's kind of my point.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, Vishesh. That's so. There's two avenues of discussion here. So, how do we determine what it is that we are doing has the impact we think it's having? So, where does that information come from? What mechanisms are in place that could potentially explain some of those impacts? So is it because the ecosystem is actively managed, that we have all these calls, that there's a sufficient level of background noise and impressive graphs floating around that people are inclined to, arb the system because they think somebody's driving the bus? Have we seen some new mechanisms arrive? And this, I agree, Vishesh, that this, the DSR has a significant impact that's obviously, I think, far more predictable than what the stability fee might be, because stability fee is more of a nebulous stick that might have long-term effects for maker holders, as opposed to the DSR being more of a benefit of the people immediately. And so people see the number go up on Oasis Save, and that's an enormous motivator to get involved and pick a number. But and we have to think about this cognitive overheads too. So if are we hurting ourselves by on a weekly basis asking people to spend hours researching the system to figure out whether numbers should go up or numbers should go down? Are we getting apathy, exhaustion there, or are we just maintaining a certain level of momentum where people are staying engaged and that there's value in that? I don't know. Or do we consider a system where we try to wait for cause and effect to be a bit clearer and potentially lower the weekly overhead we're asking from people and from ourselves? I don't know. I was trying to phrase this whole hypothetical question in a way that wasn't coloring potential outcomes. I don't know if I did a good job at it. So it's entirely possible, and I'm willing to easily concede the fact that weekly is definitely the way to go. And it will take whatever amount of effort to prove it with a series of graphs that I'm sure Vishesh and Primosh can just whip together at a moment's notice to prove to us that, we do this and that happens. Great. Okay, job done. Let's move on to our weekly cadence. But I think it's good due diligence for us to figure out whether that's actually the case or not, because if it's not, we could save ourselves a tremendous amount of operational and cognitive overhead by adjusting the cadences.
Well, I think a good way to frame that would be what does it take, right? So what would it take to justify making weekly changes? Well, you would have to be confident that the changes you're going to make have an impact that takes less than 7 days to propagate. That's the first.
Well, sure, and also like a direct relationship, right? Wouldn't it be like the stability fee has gone up this much, and then the peg moved that much, and that's the same behavior that we see week over week, right? Isn't it just like there should be a direct correlation, or at least somewhat of a direct correlation with some standard deviation?
And there's a discussion as well of like how you choose to measure the peg, right? Because it's a stylistic choice to sit there and say you want to look at the 24-hour weighted average. But if your volume is very low and you had a large quantity of trades outside of a 24-hour period that were, well above the peg, and then it just so happens that that semi-arbitrary time window has moved past those trades, and now you're looking at a tiny overall volume of trades that are below the peg, theoretically your average is now showing below the peg, even though 25 hours was a large quantity of trades. And so there may be a discussion about like a better methodology for looking at this if the purpose of that price is to drive decisions on what actions you choose to take with monetary policy.
Yeah, because that's
what
a very
about
important point.
What about it's just a test idea. Like on Mondays, Rich, you look at the recent 24 hour weighted price, and then if it's within a quarter, plus or minus a 0.25%, we skip the stability fee poll that week.
Well, and so my point is sort of maybe looking at just 24-hour slices is too naive for the purpose of what you're trying to do here. And it's more of like, if you've seen a certain, like call it over a 7-day time frame or just an infinite time frame with like a time weighted decay of like how much you're weighting trades. So that would be like a different methodology entirely.
Yeah, like a 24, 7-day, 30-day average of on a net average of the peg. And then people can say, oh, well, look at this. We haven't crossed the threshold that requires us to do any voting this week. The peg is fine if you look at it from a 7-day threshold or whatever.
Right, different like momentum ranges, maybe a better way of thinking about this. And then, sure, somebody could come along and say, well, in the last 24 hours, the price is catered, and that will take time to propagate into a longer moving average, but it will. And that's also a reasonable point to consider. So there's like a human element to it as well. Of like,
I think, another mechanism we can add on to this, though, too, is how long historically has it taken for a corrective measure in the governance ecosystem to fix the peg? So if it turns out that, sure, it cratered, and then 90% of the time it recovers a day later or something, but if there's a significant deviation, does it take 7 days, 5 days, whatever, 30 days for governance activity to correct the peg, and that's another thing, right?
Well, so, and the presupposition there is that that governance activity is what corrected the peg.
Fine.
Where
That's where we go back to the magic graphs that you're going to come up with.
Well, I'm not even 100% convinced that like that's quite simply how that works. Like, there's time involved with changes in ETH price. There's time involved with people, you know, observing and recognizing opportunities for arbitrage. There's differences in order books over time as well. And like, that's not really something that we've had the time, or at least I personally had the time to like look at in depth.
Well, that's where my uneducated perspective comes in. So maybe I'm just asking dumb questions, but here I am. I barely understand what crypto is all about. But so I look at this number, 212. Oh my God, we're mooning. I wonder what's happening to the peg. And I look at the peg and I'm like, oh, no, almost nothing. So how can I reconcile those two activities, right? So
well, in my mind,
we should have furious levels of governance activity to do an emergency peg intervention, but that hasn't been required. So what's going on is my question.
I mean, in my mind, I see that, like, I see the peg being stable at a 212 ETH price is nowhere near the same as the peg being stable at 160 ETH price. These are two very different things in my mind. And I think, like, talking about these things outside of just DAI price is, I think, a more holistic discussion. Like, there's a number of things to be considered. It's not the simplest DAI price. But, you know, this is primarily a conversation about timeframes. And I have said before, I will say again, I would be shocked if you're able to take governance actions on, you know, a faster than 7 day, but 7 day timescale even, to correct, you know, economic instabilities in the peg. Like, I don't know if, I know that it would be very unlikely, or I think it would be very unlikely to do that.
I agree. I think I have the same skepticism that and I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I don't believe that when we say, okay, whatever, stability is going to X, and therefore the direct result is that numbers have changed. I think that frequently it provides sort of a forward guidance. There's social and cultural implications that are have far more impact than direct lever pulling, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I would like to see some kind of proof either way, or evidence either way in the absence of proof.
I think it would be interesting to see. The problem is the community, I don't think, ever really allows it to happen. Data on when the peg drifts slightly and then recovers on its own without any sort of governance action. Though, especially in the SCD world, sort of TBD if that's something that we'll have observed in the MCD world. That was not really something that was happening because people would make changes faster than you would see what would happen in the system. But that's an important data point, like one way or another, to learn what does the system do if DAI drifts below the peg and no governance action is taken. How long does it take to recover? Does it recover? Does it just get worse?
Yeah, it'll be a fascinating experiment. I don't know if we need to play chicken though, with like just taking our hands off the wheel and see if we crash or not, but at least playing with cadence a bit or experimenting. Like, do we, like, let's establish a baseline. Let's figure out what it is we did in the past and what effect that had, come up with some best guesses, and then we can potentially decide, or the community can decide. I should stop saying we, it's dangerous. The community can decide if they want to, like, let's just do 2 weeks and see what happens then. And then if there's, and then get another baseline, and then if, you know, either it supports or it contradicts those assumptions, and then potentially it goes to 3 weeks, or maybe it goes back to 1 week, who knows. Cyrus, you've been suspiciously quiet. Give us a ruling. Does it sound like a great idea? Horrible idea? No,
Well,
I don't know.
Magic 8 Ball says, I'm future uncertain. All right. You polish up those dungeon D&D dice.
There was some side chat about this. Do you want me to summarize it quickly?
Yeah, if there's something interesting going on, please.
Cool. Well, I was saying, like I agreed with Vishesh, we should look at larger timeframes than just 24 hours. Sam suggested a 7-day exponential decay version. I suggested it might be good to have multiple moving averages, which I think was like 24 hours, 7-day, 30-day, 90-day would be interesting just to see. Sam sort of argued it might be more important to weigh today's data more than yesterday's data, which I'm not really convinced about, but we would need to, I don't know what the pros and cons of doing that would be. So we'd have to think about it. And then, yeah, that's most of it.
Well, the gist of what I was saying was you could, I mean, empirically, it makes sense to weigh today's data more than yesterday's. But the question is, does it make sense to weigh larger trades more or less than recent trades? And that's now a different question, right? So if something is, if a trade is 10 times larger, do you weight it, 10 times more? And then if a trade is 1 day more recent, do you weight it twice as much, 3 times as much, et cetera? So like determining what the relative scales are between weighting size of trades and volume versus recency is like a super nerdy quantitative discussion. And I don't know, maybe Sam and I can take that offline.
Could you like make a cool graph where you had like sliders to change the weightings? That'd be awesome.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, I can add that to DiePeg.
Oh, really? That'd be sweet.
Yeah, we can all come up with our own custom pictures that support our assumptions. That'd be great. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, that would be an amazing addition to DiePeg. I'm going to ruin the party. So it's we've gone 10 minutes over the Q&A session, and I think that people have work to do, and I have meetings coming up. So I would like to maybe a call to action. So maybe Sam and Vishesh, you guys going to toss this idea around a bit, and maybe we'll continue the discussion next week.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
All right. Delegation. I love it. All right. Thanks, everybody. That was a super spicy discussion. Super happy with the way these governance calls are turning out. Please join us in the forums. Reasonably sure that this chat we just had will surface there soon enough. And thanks for joining us. I'll see everybody next week.